Hello friends, and welcome to Writing Documentation with Neurodivergent Open Source Contributors in Mind. It's a pleasure to be here today at WriteTheDocs Portland 2021, and I'm looking forward to getting a chance to chat with you all today. Hello, for those of you that don't know me, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Rin Oliver, and I'm a technical community builder at Kamunja. I use they, them pronouns, and you can find me on Twitter at Kieran_Oliver or on GitHub at Solant. So you might be wondering who I am and why I'm giving this particular presentation today. That's great. Let's break that down a little bit. So for starters, I'm multiply neurodivergent. I am autistic, I have dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and ADD. I'm also a member of Kubernetes, and in the past I participated in the Contributor Experience SIG. I've spoken at Kubernetes Contributor Summit 2019 and KubeCon EU 2020. I've also been involved in the Kubernetes diversity luncheon hacks in one way or another since about 2018 or so. And I am the current Kubernetes Contributor Celebration Cake and Egg Cookie Fight Bake Off champion. If you are interested in Bake Off Throwdown, I accept challengers. This is like Iron Chef of open source. Please do feel free to challenge me to a baking competition at any time. In one way or another, I've also been involved in open source since about 2015 as a journalist and as an individual contributor to a few projects. I have been both a maintainer and a contributor to documentation, and I think that that's really important to be able to see this experience of how do we improve the documentation experience from the perspective of neurodivergent maintainers and of neurodivergent contributors as well. And I hope that after today, you all will join me in advocating for improving that open source contributor experience, especially regarding documentation for neurodivergent individuals as well. You might be wondering, what is neurodiversity? And neurodiversity is the diversity of human minds, the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species, as coined by Dr. Nick Walker in Neurocosmopolitanism. I think this is a great quote, as neurodiversity is infinite. There's an infinite variation, and I think that there's a wonderful galaxy of neurodiversity and of neurodivergence and neurodivergent individuals out there, and we are all awesome in my opinion, and it's a beautiful neurodivergent community out there, and I think that more people should take some time to get to know us all. You might be wondering, of course, why this matters. Why are we here today? So simply put, if you don't have equitable and accessible documentation laid out for not only writing, updating, and contributing to docs, but for participating in your open source community as a whole, or your software project, or even just working with others in general as team building as a whole, you're going to miss out on contributions from neurodivergent individuals, and in some cases they might not even make it through your hiring process at your organization. So that in that case, you'll miss out on our perspectives, you won't get to hear our ideas, and we've got a lot of strategies from firsthand experience for improving not only your community, but its documentation as a whole, and how you can make those processes better for individuals that are neurodivergent. It's also really important to note that if you've met someone that's neurodivergent, you've met just one person that's neurodivergent. We don't all have to share the same experiences, and I think it's important to also imagine how much more you might be missing out on. So that's why this matters, and that's why we're here today. So let's break down getting started. And this might seem like a really challenging task, but we're going to get through it and we'll be all right. So let's break down how we can get started with writing those docs. Open source is hard to get into as the hows are not very clear, and neurodivergent people may not understand the process that easily. This is a quote I heard from a participant in my Smashing the Barriers to Open Source Software Contribution presentation I gave at Mozilla Festival in 2019, and that was in London, back when we could travel, so I missed that. We'd love to go back to London sometime. Let's break this down a little bit. The first part, very true. Open source is hard to get into. The hows aren't very clear, and neurodivergent people may not understand the process that easily. That second part is what's really important, because we as documentation maintainers and documentation professionals have the power to change that, because documentation is writing down processes. So we have the capability right here, right now, to make those hows clear and make that process clearer and help neurodivergent individuals get involved with open source and contribute to documentation. So for writing equitable and accessible docs, there's a few things you can do. First things first, localization efforts are critical to your success. There's a massive localization effort in Kubernetes, for example, and there's so many people involved in that. And Kubernetes is being translated into a different language very often, and I know there's at least more than one, and there's probably at this rate more than 5 languages. I'm not really sure though, don't quote me on it. Languages that Kubernetes and their documentation have been translated into, and I think that's amazing. Something else that you can do to make your documentation equitable is to try and avoid jargon. Jargon is one of those things where it's hit or miss. You might be in an industry where you can't really avoid it. So if you can't avoid jargon, it's really important that you try to have a glossary available with up-to-date definitions of terms that you use in your industry or for your product. And you can also try to, make your language positive. Don't talk down to your users. I've never seen documentation that does this, but if I did, it's really clear what it looks like when someone's talking down to you in terms of, well, examples of that look like, you should know this if, etc. We've all seen it. And that's why it's important to use that positive language and make sure that you're being encouraging to not only your users, but to your contributors to your documentation. And if you're accepting contributions, you should also try to set really clear benchmarks of what those PRs, pull requests that come in, should look like. I think that's really important too, is to have those expectations there. So here's some tips for implementing everything that we just talked about. So for localization, if someone approaches you requesting to translate your docs, ideally you should have those processes in place before they come to you. You don't want to have someone saying, we'd love to translate your docs into, say, for example, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, or we want to translate them to Japanese, or we want to translate them to Spanish, or whatever language that may be, and you don't have anything for them. You have no process in place. You have no idea how they're going to get started doing this. Ideally, you should have that laid out. Have a section of your contributor guide dedicated to localization efforts. Tell them how to get started and establish those best practices for localization teams. How will they work together with your team? How will they ensure that their translations are accurate, etc.? So ideally, you should take some time to sit down and lay that out, because it's better to have that in place and not need it than to need it and not have it. Writing a glossary, as I mentioned, is super helpful if you can't avoid using company or industry-specific jargon. So once you have that glossary, it's really important that you surface it on your site. I've been to many websites where the glossary is hidden away, tucked into some remote corner of the website, and you can't find it when you need it. So you should link to the glossary whenever a term's used that someone might not know off the top of their head. It's not common vernacular. If you know that it's not common, link in the glossary. And it's also important to audit your docs. If you see a documentation page that's basically entirely glossary, entirely made up of links to your glossary, you might want to take a look and see if you can rewrite that. So positive language doesn't have to be difficult. It can be thanking people for their contributions. It can be encouraging them when they submit code for review, and also being compassionate and understanding rather than nitpicking small changes. So ways to make this easier for maintainers are using templates for new pull requests, and new templates for issues is a really great way to make sure that PRs coming in adhere to your style guide. They'll make it past your linter, and that makes those PRs from outside contributors faster to review and much faster to merge. So if you're not using templates in GitHub and GitLab, I highly encourage you to do so. That will make your life as a maintainer a lot easier. So here's some best practices that we can all keep in mind when we're writing docs. I love these captions. So let's break down what works and what doesn't. Some things that are helpful are having a DRI, and you're going to hear me say this a lot. DRI is a directly responsible individual. This is your person that people can go to if they have questions about your product or questions about your docs. And you should ideally, that DRI should be someone who owns particular sections of that documentation. So they will own updating it, they'll own making changes, reviewing PRs, etc. That person is responsible for that particular section. Some pieces may belong to your DevRel team, some might be your engineering team, some might be marketing. whoever that is, know who people can go to if they have questions, and say, if you have questions about this section of the docs, you can talk to this individual and they'll help you get started. So another thing that's important for helping neurodivergent contributors is if your documentation has environment setup or demo steps, if you could break those down one at a time in your docs, that would be great. That way people can clearly say, I got stuck on step 7, rather than having to wade through a paragraph of instructions and try to figure out where they might have gotten stuck. You should also really try to clearly state what sections of your docs are accepting pull requests, if any are. If you don't want outside pull requests, say that somewhere, because nothing is worse than, as a contributor, trying to fix a section of documentation and the maintainer comes back and says, actually, we're not looking for contributions at this time, we're going to close this pull request. That feels bad. Nobody wants to be that person. So if you're not really accepting outside pull requests at all, you should also say, feel free to email us. We'll take your suggestion in mind, and you might see it in a future version of our docs. Thank you for getting in touch with us. There's many ways you can approach that, but either way, clearly stating if your docs are accepting pull requests is really important and something you should absolutely strive to do. So some things that aren't really helpful are rejecting improvements that got something almost done rather than completed. There's a lot of ways as a maintainer you can approach this. If a contributor got something most of the way there, I would rather help them and work with them to get that most of the way there pull request merged so they can feel accomplished and empowered than saying, we're not going to accept this entire pull request because it's not entirely done. That way, it might be a little extra work, but it will really help that contributor and it will really make them feel valued and encourage them to contribute again in the future. So inaccessible docs are a pain point of mine. You should always keep in mind that people use screen readers and they might not be able to process audio from a how-to tutorial that's embedded in your documentation. You should also try to have things like transcripts available or captions. These are things that can make your docs more accessible and thus easier to use and easier to implement for others. So try to make your docs accessible by doing these things. And I think we've all learned a bit more about them as the pandemic's gone on, but you should try to keep these accessibility guidelines in mind for sure. And it's also really unhelpful if your troubleshooting documentation is outdated or if it's missing information that people need if something goes wrong. So you should always try to audit your troubleshooting docs and make sure that everything is still correct and that if something goes wrong for a recent release, that the troubleshooting steps are still accurate and they'll still get people to the solution they need to proceed with your docs and your instructions. So let's break that down a little bit further. Let's see what that looks like. Missing information is definitely the main challenge facing readers of documentation, and it's also a problem for contributors. If something's missing and you don't know about it, you can't fix it as a contributor. You don't know what's missing because you're not a mind reader. You're just coming in and using the information you have that's already in the docs and that's already in issues that are labeled, for example, good first issue, but without context. And if there's information missing from that issue, then you're on your own basically. So you should always consider as an author of documentation how that information gets updated, who's responsible for doing so, and not only that, but how to convey that information that makes it accessible in ways for everyone that might need it to be able to digest that information in ways that are useful and implementable for them, however that might look. So that's where a DRI comes in. A DRI is responsible for filling in those missing gaps, and it can be really helpful for making sure that there's no missing information and that people can get started contributing to your docs right away. So again, jargon, using heavily detailed terms without a clear definition is really frustrating for users and it's frustrating for readers of your documentation. So try to avoid that if you can, for sure. Structure is important too, so having documentation that spans different tones and styles, especially based on who contributed, is really challenging for neurodivergent individuals to parse. For example, people that have dyslexia find it really challenging to read different tones of writing, and some people that have auditory processing or visual processing issues in terms of text can find text that spans different tones and different tenses, particularly first to third person and back again, really challenging to parse. So this is where a style guide can come in handy. So that would having a style guide means that your documentation is uniform in the tone that you use, the terms that you use, and things are defined in a clear way, and they're used that way throughout your entire documentation process. So having an audit and going through your documentation and updating it to adhere to your style guide is something that you might want to look into if your tenses and tones jump around a lot based on your contributors. So this is also where skeletons come in handy, and skeletons are our friends. Having a rough outline of what your documentation structure and layout should be in a perfect ideal state helps you to not only plan new documentation, but to refine old documentation to bring it up to date with your new current docs. And you might be wondering what an accessible skeleton would look like. And that's a clear header format that stays consistent H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, all the way down. Don't jump around from H1 to H3 to H5 and back again. Keep it clear and consistent. And if you have any animated UI or UX elements or CSS on your page, you should also strive to remember the WCAG guidelines for pausing, stopping, and hiding those animated assets. Your users and contributors should always be able to pause something on your docs. They should never have to have it autoplay. You should always have the opportunity to pause it, stop it, or hide it. So you should also, again, try to give your install and setup instructions one at a time. And this is where bulleted lists come in handy. If you really want to make a quick bulleted list, Markdown is a great way to do that. You should also have your subheadings labeled and hyperlinked in a table of contents. I usually try to put those under the H2 in a document. If you're writing documentation, that's where I like to put them, but you can put them anywhere, honestly. You should also have alt text added to your images. Alt text is huge, and subtitles and transcripts for audio-visual content as well. And have a glossary if you need one. And as always, remember to keep that glossary up to date. Do an audit and assess what needs to be added, what can be taken away, etc. So when it's time to tackle what's next, here's how to start writing. So first things first, you're going to want to define your scope. You need to know how long that project's going to take, if you're going to accept outside contributions, and if you have a style guide, or are you going to need to actually write one from scratch? And if you do need to write one from scratch, you're just going to be at the bottom of the pyramid for a while, because that's probably going to take a really long time. And you're also going to want to define how you're going to work with teams that aren't necessarily just yours. How are you going to work with the engineering team? How are you going to work with the marketing team to update documentation that spans across multiple departments and has those multiple touch points and potentially multiple handoffs that could get things roadblocked? And that's where, when you get started and you've scoped that project, you should communicate your progress and note roadblocks that come up, and make sure that if you're working across interdepartmentally, that you're aware of roadblocks on both sides. So to that note, when your documentation process is complete, you can also improve and iterate on it. You can make improvements, you can make changes that will improve the experience of your users. Documentation should never just be one and done. It shouldn't be static. It should always be updated if it can. And as changes come along, you should always try to improve, and you should try to make that documentation better with each iteration of your product. So scope creep is a problem in documentation in particular. And that's where we all know it, where you're in the weeds and you're just hacking your way through. And scope creep is something that we'd all love to avoid in documentation projects. And when working cross-collaboratively, really try not to be afraid to speak up when something's approaching scope creep. This can be something you could say, for example, "Thank you for your feedback. I'll be sure to take it in mind and consider it for the next release," or anything really. The point is to advocate for yourself as a documentation professional. If you know something's scope creepy, put your foot down and say, "We'll consider it next time. Thank you for your feedback." Another thing you can do to avoid scope creep is designate who owns updates and maintenance to particular sections of documentation before you start to write those docs. Because if you're already writing, someone might assume that you own maintenance to those docs, and then they come along and they ask you for a change, but you're not the person that's going to be maintaining that long term. So if you know who owns what piece of the docs before you start writing them, that will make your life a lot easier in the long term. So for drafting, revising, and publishing, drafting docs collaboratively is huge for neurodivergent individuals. Some people like it, some people don't, but I know for me and my particular neurodivergence, I figured I would bring up tools like hackmd.io. I love HackMD because it's basically like Google Docs for writing Markdown docs. And it also ports those docs directly to GitHub or GitLab or any other place where you can store documentation. Or not any, but there's a lot of them. The main ones are GitHub and GitLab. So drafting documentation collaboratively is really useful for neurodivergent individuals in that it's nice to see how other people approach writing documentation. It's great to have that collaborative feedback. And it's also just nice to get everybody's thoughts when it comes to that process, especially if you're working on a really large documentation project. So using tools like HackMD are beneficial when multiple points of view need to be considered, particularly if you're working with multiple team members across different departments as well. So I like HackMD in that sense as well. It's a really great tool, and I highly encourage you to use it if you'd like to draft your documentation in a collaborative sense that's not Google Docs. If revising and publishing your docs you find that really tedious, you should also make an effort to consider publishing tools like Doxy or DocuSource. Those can help make that process a lot easier, and implementing frameworks like Hugo can help as well. These are tools that make maintaining, revising, and publishing documentation a lot easier, not only for people that are neurodivergent, but for people that are neurotypical. Revising and publishing documentation doesn't have to be a pain point, and there are tools out there to help make that easier for you. So as for updates, you should always make sure to audit your docs regularly and note where updates need to be made, and you can assign them to that DRI and say, hey, can you make this change for us? That'll be great. I'll review it and merge it. And if there's a breaking change, it's really important that you communicate that change far in advance to your users. This is huge. Nobody wants to announce a breaking change and users read it in the docs before they hear it from you. So always try to announce your breaking changes via blog, social media, email, whatever contact you have before it's in the docs. Make sure people know it's on the way. But of course, update that breaking change in your docs so people know it's there and they can reference it back in history. It needs to be in all the places, but don't have the first place they see it be in your release notes. That would be not ideal. And if you see a section of docs that need to be updated, you can feel free to raise a PR and open an issue and just sign that DRI. So if you see something and you're like, that needs to be changed, it's also good to just, when you see it, raise a PR, open an issue, and say, this needs to be changed, just so we know in the future. So let's review really quick what we've learned so far. First things first, be helpful. That looks like just being there for people, answering their questions, being kind and considerate, etc. Also, avoid jargon. Throw it in the trash. It goes away. We don't need it. And if you do have it, have a glossary. Another thing that we'd love to learn is have a skeleton, the ideal version of your documentation that you'd like everything to look like. That outline will help save you time, and templating your documentation out will make a much better process for future you and future contributors. Another thing is to keep your documentation updated. By updating your docs, you're not going to be stuck making changes to bring things in line with the last 4 releases. If you have things current and you're updating them as you do them, it makes your life a lot easier down the line. Another thing is obviously to know who owns it. Know who owns that section of the documentation, who you put your contributors to if they have trouble, and who's going to be responsible for maintaining those documentation sections in the long run. And of course, you can also improve and iterate. So making those improvements, making those iterated changes will make the lives of your users and your contributors better in the long run if you're continuously improving your documentation process. So how do we put that all into practice? Let's break that down. I feel like this is not just our responsibility as documentation practitioners, it's an opportunity as documentation authors. Like I said in the beginning of this presentation, we have the power to break down these processes and define them clearly to make that open source software contribution experience better for neurodivergent individuals. And these are changes that we can take back today. So in that vein, what have you learned that you're going to take back today that you'll bring to your company or your open source project to make your documentation more accessible and equitable to those that are neurodivergent? I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to tag me on Twitter. If you've learned something here today that you're going to take back to your company, please feel free to let me know. I would absolutely love to hear about it, and I'd love to chat with you further. And I'd also love to know how you're going to encourage new documentation contributions from neurodivergent individuals moving forward, or new documentation contributions in general with these improvements that you've learned today. Anything really, I would love to hear about it. So thank you so much for joining me today at Write the Docs Portland 2021. If you have a question, I'll be available for a Q&A after the presentation. Feel free to join me. I'll be around for about 15 minutes or so. And you can also find me online, like I said, at Twitter at Kieran_Oliver, and on GitHub at Celant, CELANTHE. And again, thank you so much to the organizers for Write the Docs Portland for having me today, and I will see you all soon at the Q&A. What a joy. What a joy. What a delight. Made my day. How cool. That's fun. That's really fun.
Yeah, more thanks
Thank you for having me.
Too.
This was good. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much for having me. I love these Q&A things. My hair is like today.
No, you look awesome. No. Thanks. But I think people really connected with this talk well, and I think it's such a good topic for Write the Docs because it's all about inclusion here. And I really love how you talked about how it not only benefits the individual if we can be inclusive towards neurodivergent people, but you were totally right in that it benefits the whole community. Like we allow contributions from everybody. Like that's perfect and something we should all be thinking about. So thank you for sharing that with us.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I'm super, super happy to have provided valuable resources, and that means a lot to me to hear that. It's really good. Like, this has been super awesome. Like, this whole event is great. I love docs. I love writing docs, and reading docs, and that whole thing is, like, amazing. So
you're totally in the right place, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
We had a couple of questions.
The
first one is from Christy, who's wondering, is there a localization guide or set of best practices that you particularly like? And can you refer us to one if you do?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Kubernetes localization, and there was actually another one that was just sent in the chat, which was on the stage. I hope it didn't appear, but if I can get in my history, there was also a checklist that somebody had that they posted was a docs checklist. I like the Kubernetes localization checklist personally, and then there's this wonderful one that someone posted that was their localization prep checklist, and I will drop it in the general chat.
Right. Judy just posted a GitHub one.
Yes,
and
that's
it's good for us
probably it. Yes.
Yeah. It's good to note in the video because later on when people are watching on YouTube, they won't be able to see the chat. So it's good. Kubernetes, GitHub. Now we know.
Yep. Kubernetes and GitHub localization check prep list. Yes, that's beautiful. That was good. Yeah, those are the ones that I would say Kubernetes is a great one to have. That's perfect. Thank you, Judy. You're wonderful. That exact thing. Awesome. Yeah. Localization is huge because it's such a thing where it's like people they write their docs in their language, which is fine. But if people come to you and they say, I want to localize your docs, and you have nothing for them, not at least have something to be like, maybe someone might someday want to localize this. They might want to translate it. And if they're using it, it's like you're not meaning to shut out your users, but you're shutting out your own community. So it's like you should probably have something there for them.
Totally. Christy had another question.
Beautiful.
And it's about transcripts versus captions and whether you have, and I know that you probably saw there was some conversation in the chat, but what are your opinions about, maybe one is appropriate in one scenario and the other in, how would you compare them to each other as resources?
I like them both, honestly. My wife's dyslexic and I am autistic and I have auditory processing issues. So I prefer transcripts because I read faster. And I am quicker at reading visual information, but my wife would prefer a caption because she likes to read. It's easier for her to hear things than read them. So we're opposites in that way. So it really depends. I would say use both if you can get away with it.
That's a really great point that different people use them for different reasons. And Brooke, who spoke last year, was kind enough to share that there's a huge difference between what's transcribed by people versus AI. And we've got Vanessa, our amazing transcriptionist, who's typing everything we say right now, which I think helps people understand things a lot more easily than, an AI getting things wrong. So definitely, I think a really big point.
I get things wrong a lot, actually, and I use Google Slides. I use the Google Slides just because it's the quickest thing for me, because I've never really worked with live transcriptionists until this event, and I have Desert Island DevOps on Friday. They're working with live transcriptionists also. So those are the first times that I've had that available to me, and it's really been nice, actually. Human powered captions are so much better, and I will always argue for those moving forward, because Google Docs and their auto translate, I have no idea what I'm saying half the time. So
yes.
it's just like, what? Melissa has a question about large old documentation. Do I have any services or groups that can help them assess the state of the documentation and what they can do to make it more accessible? Ooh, I don't actually. I have, I'm sure there's individuals out there that offer that service. One that comes to mind that I can think of, I think, is Sage Sharp. Let me Google. This person, yes, is a diversity and inclusion person who runs code of conduct clinics, but they might know someone. Yes, Sage might know somebody. I would ask them, definitely. Another place to go would definitely, again, be Kubernetes. Has a bunch of resources for that whole thing. For assessing documentation, I would go to the WCAG and run it through just your average checklist, like graphic designers do it for accessibility. Just run it through and get the score back and say, here's the massive list of things we need to change that will ping for accessibility. It will say this contrast is wrong, this heading is wrong, this isn't accessible for a screen reader, and it just gives you a list. There's a lot of places that will rank your website for accessibility, and it's often a good place to start.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Michelle also just asked a question. So what are some tactful ways I can let neurodivergent contributors know that I can flex my approach to help them contribute? Which I think is a great question.
Ooh, that is a good question. Gosh. Honestly, I would say link to it in your documentation. Say, we welcome contributions from neurodivergent individuals, and here's what we'll do to support you. Just lay it out blunt. Be like, we will help you with your pull request. We will help you with communication with other people if you need it. We'll help you with extra time for PR review. Just lay out what you'll do for people. Say, this is a welcoming environment. We want you to feel empowered, and state how you're going to support people moving forward. And yes, code of conduct, also helpful. Always have a code of conduct and say, we don't state very clearly that you don't allow discrimination based on neurodiversity. So.
Love it. Always so good to think about when you have any sort of community.
Absolutely.
And speaking of communities, we had a couple of questions in the chat about online communities for neurodivergent people. Do you have a favorite, or do you know, are there multiple maybe?
Gosh. Actually, I have one neurodiversity Discord that I hang out in, private one. Other than that, gosh, I tend to honestly not. I somehow always fall in with other neurodivergent folks, but I don't actively have like a place where I go. No, I just somehow always meet other neurodivergent people somehow, which is wild, but it's true. Like, it always happens that way, where it's like, yeah, okay, now there's a bunch of neurodivergent people in the same space, and I don't actively hang out anywhere, though, honestly. I haven't really been outside for the last year and a half, so not really many places to go. Yeah, exactly. Haven't been outside. Hold that thought.
No, totally.
Yeah, there's like, I love the DevRel Discord or the DevRel Slack for other DevRels, the DevRel Collective, pretty great place to hang out. Love it. The Kubernetes Slack, also a great place to hang out. Love that too. There's of course WriteTheDocs Slack, always good. Mozilla Festival has a nice neurodiversity Slack actually for MozFest. They have a really nice neurodiversity channel, and I like it there. That is a fun place to hang out. If you're in the MozFest Slack, join their Slack. They have a neurodiversity channel. It's pretty great.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rin. I think a lot of people really, really connected with this talk on a personal level.
Great.
I really appreciate everything that you did to give us all this information.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a real pleasure, Jean. Thank you very much.